Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar focused on tomorrow's client relationships. I'm Bramwell Johnson. I'm Director of Content at the Communications Agency Propeller, and I'll be hosting and moderating today. Now, it's fair to say the past 12 months have put pressures on client agency relationships. We've all had to find new ways of communicating and doing things, but this is what agencies should excel at. They're naturally geared to adapting and evolving. This year, we all hope growth's returning for brands and their agency partners, and the signs are good. We're seeing some shoots of green recovery. So it is an opportune moment to take a breath and think about how client agency relationships can be strengthened and the risk of future relationship breakdowns minimized. Now, this new book, and I hope you can all see it, Connecting with Clients, written by Cowan, is the inspiration for today's session. It can help guide people at all levels of a business through how to transform relationships for the better. And it is packed with advice, insights, and examples. Now, Paul was in agency land for many years, and his postings included Group Account Director at Saatchi & Saatchi. He later founded an agency, Cowan Kemsley Taylor, and he went on to gain master's degrees in organizational change and Gestalt psychotherapy, establishing eventually both a change agency and a private therapy practice for individuals and couples. He's making me feel quite inadequate, actually. And in 2004, he co-founded the Client Relationship Consultancy, working with all kinds of advertising and marketing agencies. He co-founded the Customer Relationship Consultancy in 2011 for B2B agencies. So I think it's fair to say he's got a view on client agency relationships from a variety of angles. Now, how this session is going to work is that Paul and I are going to spend 10 minutes or so talking about the origins and uses of the book. And then we'll go into panel mode with our special guests to discuss ways to create and maintain a productive client agency relationship. And we should definitely have time for a Q&A. So I really do encourage you to use the chat box as we talk to make points and ask questions as we go along. We'd like it to be as interactive as we can. So I'd now like to bring up Paul so we can start our chat.
Hello, thank you for the introduction.
Hello, Paul. Good to see you. Good to see you. Obvious first question, really. What is this book about? If you haven't read it, and I'm sure everyone will want to read it, but if you haven't read it, what is the book about?
So from my perspective, this book is about, yes, client relationships, of course it is. That's the title. It's about how to improve them. But fundamentally, there are two levels of issue or problem in any relationship. There's problem A up here, which is the task at hand. Whatever agency you're working in, the budget, the strategy, the deliverables, whatever that is that you spend your time on. And then there's problem B. And problem B goes underneath. It's how do we get on with the client? How does the client get on with us? Now, the client's experience of us in dealing with problem A, that issue up here, those day-to-day issues, is always mediated by their experience of problem B. And this book is about problem B, the relationship itself. And so that's the focus of this. And, you know, one of the things for me about problem B is that nobody gets taught about the skills about relationship management. And by the way, this also applies to couples as well. And I guess if it was, I wouldn't have a business, any business, actually. So this is about skills. It's about ideas that come from outside the business, from different worlds of expertise. And I had a fantastic opportunity to step outside and then look at the business again and realize, wow, there's so much that we can bring into the business to really help relationships and to make up for the absence of training or skills development in managing problem B. You might think, well, why is problem B important? Well, you know, there's a kind of truism, which is agencies get hired for the work and they get fired for the relationship. You know, through the client relationship consultancy, and we deal with, I don't know, 1,200 agency offices. We support them across 92 different countries. We know that by and large, agencies can hang on to accounts even when the work is not that great. And they can lose accounts when the work is great, but somehow the relationship is wrong. So all of this is about supporting agencies to improve the way that problem B is managed. And why now? Well, now is really important. What I really hope about this book is that in the world where we're getting increasing fragmentation of, agency client relationships in housing, real specialisms developing. Actually, the one thing, there's a world of uncertainty, and I would say all of those things mean that there's a greater pressure. There's going to be increasing pressure. There's going to be increasing uncertainty. And the one thing we can get better at is problem B. One thing that is really within our control. And so all of this is about bringing ideas, issues, so that everybody in whichever agency, in whichever country in the world can think, wow, I've got all of this resource that I can draw upon. That's it. How about that for a commercial break? I think that's quite a good commercial, actually.
The commercial break comes halfway through, obviously.
Okay,
30-second spots. No, it's a great read, and what I really enjoyed was the fact you could dip into it and look at any particular chapter and get some insights. You don't have to read the book end to end or in any chronological order. But for those people who get the book and take a look through it, what is the key thing you would like them to take away?
There's one thing I would like is that agency execs, whatever level, whether they're graduate, first day, or really experienced top level C-suite, that instead of spending 99% or 99.9% of their time working at problem A, trying to make the work right, spend 10% every day on work getting problem B right, because 10% of the day will really reap rewards in terms of margins, longer lasting relationships, happier teams, and hey, happier, more rewarding life. And I think that's the one thing I would really like them to take away.
No, that is very sound advice. 10% is the marker to aim for. I'm an ex-journalist, so I'm always curious about how people actually assemble their material and content. So I just wondered if you can say anything about how you went about pulling the book together. Did you keep notes over many, many years, or did you carry out any formal interviews? What was the process?
So when I was trained both as a change agent working within organizations and as a therapist, it's absolute rigor in keeping notes, because they really help to recall impressions and what goes on day to day when things get lost so quickly. And so over the last 14, 15, actually a bit longer, 16 years of working with a client relationship consultancy after co-founding it, I've kept notes of all the meetings and all the sessions. And of course, I've got all my therapy notes as well. All of them, of course, are anonymized. And that has been a massive, and it still is. I mean, there's lockers full of anonymized notes. And so actually the material is right there. And it was then as crisp, and ready to bring into life. So all of this is grounded in personal experience. And of course, not only that, but it's also the experience of specific consulting projects working with clients and agencies. And again, although it's anonymized, some people say, hey, I know that's me, because they can recognize themselves. But yeah, it's all grounded in real examples of client, agency, and couple relationships.
Wow, what a rich resource you've got in those notes. That's amazing. The book is full of it. I expect nothing less. The book is full of amazing advice, amazing insights, and obviously you've learned many things throughout your career. Just wondered who would be your biggest influence or mentor on the way you work and your thoughts, and what was the key thing they taught you?
I guess the person that influenced me most was Dr. David Daniels. He was professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford and medical school. And he taught me that if you can understand the background to somebody, then you can really step into their shoes. And the same true for organizations, and really begin to understand them. And David was the most amazing, beautiful human being. And one of the most, the most magnificent man I've ever met because of his humanity. And he taught me to really be understanding of people and to think about them as real human beings with their own struggles. And I haven't necessarily been a terribly forgiving person in my life, and he taught me really to be more understanding and more human.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that, Paul. That sounds very important to you. Right, we are going to move on to the next part of the session. We're going to open up and bring on our panel, who I will ask to introduce themselves. Before they come up, I'll just remind you that we have Q&A time, so do put in Q&A and any observations as well. Right, let's bring in our panel, please. And I will ask them to introduce themselves one by one. Can we start, please, with Kat? Go on, introduce yourself and your remit.
Hi everyone, my name is Kat de Keyser and I am a managing partner at OMD UK.
Thank you. And over to Caroline, please.
Hello, I'm Caroline Davison. I'm a managing director and sustainability leader at ELVIS London. We're a creative agency specialising in FMCG clients.
Thank you. And by the magic of technology, all the way from Colorado, we have Kelly. Kelly, tell us your remit.
I am Kelly Reilly, and I am currently the CEO and CMO of Red Thread Coffee Company, which is a cold brew coffee brand. Prior to that, actually, I started my career in advertising. So I spent years in advertising before I actually moved over to a large consumer packaged good brand as their global head of marketing. So, you know, having that perspective of both the agency and the client side, I'm hoping that I can bring a somewhat balanced and unique perspective to the panel. So thanks for having me.
Marvelous. We have a lot of different perspectives to bring to the table here, which is great. Well, let's get the ball rolling. I'm going to start with a kind of broad brush question, really. What are the fundamentals of a good, stable, long-lasting client-agency relationship? And I would like to avoid the cliche of be a partner, not a supplier, because while it's true, I have heard it an awful lot from an awful lot of places. So just looking at the broad brush fundamentals that underpin a good, stable relationship. Kat, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the word that kind of sums that up for me is trust. That's the most important thing, and kind of focusing on that trust. And there's a nice section in Paul's book all about avoiding the bullshit. And I think as agencies, we can be a little bit susceptible to bullshit, because we always want to be on our best, showing we're on our toes, challenging. And that kind of approach can often limit and inhibit listening. And through listening, you can really develop an authentic and kind of trusted relationship. And once you have that trust, maintaining that trust is absolutely sacred to the health of that relationship. And I think if you've got that, then you can do a lot. And it's a two-way thing. You need to, you know, trust your client, and the client needs to kind of trust the agency. But that for me is the absolute kind of fundamental building block of any positive and long-term relationship.
Caroline, would you build on that in terms of what the fundamental building blocks of the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Trust, I think, is fundamental. I think that the bit that comes after that is using that trust to understand each other's expectations. And I think those expectations are very much the expectations that kind of Paul set up in his introduction, which is it's not just the transactional bits, it's not understanding, you know, the ROI or the penetration number, it's understanding what they are wanting to get out of you as people and as an agency. And I think quite often it's very easy to you know, especially if you just want to pitch, to jump straight into the great, yep, we've been appointed, let's go. You get caught up in that excitement and you stop just to think what it is that they saw in you, what it is that excited them, what they think that you're bringing as a unique group of people to the table. And so understanding those expectations sets you up so well for that long-lasting kind of relationship. So yeah, I think actually trust and expectations go hand in hand here.
And I would so agree with both of you, and sort of build on the concept of trust by adding the word collaboration. For me, strong collaboration is critical. And it's not just, so many people think it's just like CEO to CEO or head of agency to the head of the client side, but it's really collaboration across every single level, making sure that there is that mutual respect. And then, of course, I think making sure that there is a commitment on both sides to delivering against the goals of both the client and the agency. So I would say, trust and collaboration are key.
And I actually think that, sorry, just going back to the expectation point, like you have to tell them what your expectations of them are as well, right? Because otherwise it's just a one-sided relationship, and you've both got to get something out of it for the relationship to be a success. That's why it's like couple therapy, right? There has to be two people in that relationship.
Agree.
Paul, have you got anything you'd say about the broad brush building block before we get a little granular?
No, what I think what's really interesting is you're all talking about trust, and trust happens between individuals. It's difficult to trust an organization. I can't put myself, trust. I know when it's been broken. I really feel it. Somebody has betrayed me, and it's the body. And so I think that personal connection that does happen between individuals, key individuals, or individuals all the way up and down the chain, is important. It's critically important. And I think it's more difficult these days when we have the rise of procurement, whose challenge, of course, is to find a confident, they want confidence that the agency is going to deliver the minimum. Whereas actually the personal relationships, the real trust is we're actually going to go above and beyond. We're going to excite the client. And I think there's a real, a tension actually between the procurement driven and what we want, what agencies want to do in terms of building that confidence, that reciprocal confident relationship. So I think it's a really interesting time.
No, that's an incredibly good point about the personal. There are going to be a lot of new relationships starting this year, obviously, as reviews pick up momentum and the new members of teams come in as well. I'm sure there's been churn there, both on client side and on agency side of teams. So whole sets of new relationships are beginning to appear. I'm interested to know how you start a relationship off on the right foot from an agency and client point of view, a new relationship. How do you get it off on the right foot and make that strong first impression? And Kelly, can I ask you to bring in from the client point of view first? What do you want to see for that initial start of a relationship?
Sure. I mean, initially, I think there's sort of two big things. And the first one is an obvious one, in that I think the onus is on the client to provide the agency with a really comprehensive debrief on the business. What are our goals, business objectives, marketing objectives, what's the historical work, what are the team dynamics? And so I really think that face-to-face and again, onus on the client to deliver that and ground the new agency and the business is critical. The other thing I think is really important, and I really got this from Paul's book, but I think it's brilliant. And it's this idea that you establish like psychological expectations, something you will never see in a scope of work, right? But it is so critical because it allows both client and agency to communicate what are our hopes and dreams, what are our sort of expectations, sort of the softer side of the relationship. So an example is, I love to send emails really late at night, but I don't expect people to answer me till the next day. Or, and I'm a stickler about this. Every time I meet with an agency, I expect them to come with a point of view. And you'd be surprised at how many agencies don't have a recommendation or point of view. But having me communicate that to my agency so that they know these things, these psychological behaviors that are triggers for me or are important to me, I think just helps us get off on the right foot.
I totally agree with that. We call it a people principle conversation, because we found that if you call it a psychological contract, then people are like right. It sounds quite intimidating, really. It's like kind of moving into shrink territory. And so we call it people principles, and we like having those conversations as well, just to get you off on the right foot. And the other thing that we find really valuable is if you say what your intention is from the off. So it's like, but we're always going to try and operate with the best possible intentions, but we're going to get that wrong sometimes. Can we both agree that we'll stop and we'll talk about it when we get it wrong? Because at some point we are going to get it wrong, and there will be a conflict. So if we can both give each other the benefit of the doubt and have that conversation first, then it's a much nicer way to ease into a relationship than waiting for that moment to happen. So yeah, great to hear that from a client perspective as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's it's interesting trying to create that space that sits outside of all of the onboarding documents, the transition plan, the project scope of work, the actual contract itself, the service level agreement. Like, we have all these wonderful acronyms for all of these different things, and actually it's remembering the human side of the relationship and really focusing in on that. I'll always remember we had a kind of one of these sessions to kind of tee up a new client relationship, and one of the clients just said to us really clearly, just so we're all clear, end of play for me is not agency end of play, which is code for like some point that day, but it's actual 5:30 p.m. So if I ask for something by then, that's when I expect it. And that's a small thing in the grand scheme that you wouldn't get in a service level agreement or in a contract, but was a really useful setup for, okay, we completely understand that and we will make that happen. And it's just creating the space for that kind of human engagement, understanding what matters to me. And obviously what sits behind that is, for that particular individual, that's when I clock off to spend time with my children, and that's a real focus for me. So I think it's that space that's really important to create at the start of a relationship, so it's human as well as transactional and work focused. I think to what Paul was saying earlier about kind of problem A and problem B.
Great to hear.
Paul,
well, I'm just saying this is great, and of course we've got three very benign and supportive panelists here, and our client has been an ex-agency, and many clients will not be as Kelly is, and it does take a bit of effort to get them there, and I think it is really worthwhile. I'm really pleased to hear you talk about this because it is so important, surfacing those issues, because psychological contracts, whatever you want to call them, are generally evidence when things go wrong and we get disappointed, and then we don't know why we're getting disappointed, but we can, end of the day, 5:30, but actually to be able to be clear about what it is that's really important to us or irritating us, it is so fundamental, and training clients to do that, which I think most agencies forget about. If we can train clients to teach us how to work well with them, and we can teach them about us, and that's great. So yeah, that's really good.
Okay, well, once a relationship is up and running, hopefully in a positive way, then everyone should want to produce great work. Great and effective work does depend on getting a good brief, and I'm curious to know if between us we think that strong directional briefs are still the norm, and if not, what guidance can each party give to making sure that the briefs are the best they can be, so the best work can be produced. And Kelly, just going back to you, I guess, because from a client side perspective, how do you approach briefing in a project for one of your agencies?
Well, I'm here to tell everyone that clients are not great at developing briefs. Let's just get that right out on the table. We want to put everything in there, right? We don't want to sacrifice a thing, and we certainly don't want to focus. But I think we all know, every agency knows that a bad brief is more than likely going to result in bad work. And so I think what I try to do from a brief standpoint is provide something that is single-minded and focused, and provides the agency with a true insight, something that they can work with, that will inspire them to ultimately create great work. I would also say that it's so critical that you don't just send the brief to the agency and expect them to just interpret it and run, right? That face-to-face, communication and review of the brief, so that the agency has an opportunity to push back and challenge assumptions or clear up miscommunications. If you spend the time to do that, and everybody walks away on the same page, you have a much greater chance of producing great work that hits the mark the first time.
Kat, what's your experience been of late of the briefs that you're working with and the way the client puts a project in front of you?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a change in the way that briefings have happened because of the year that we've been through, and how essentially as of kind of March 2020, marketing plans that had been crafted and people had spent ages and been through various levels of sign off ultimately got ripped up as, you know, restaurants closed, you know, manufacturing closed, you know, everything had to be rewritten and moved at great speed. And there was, you know, a great amount of partnership and agility in achieving that. But I think where we're getting to now is, as we're getting to, thankfully, a better place in terms of the pandemic, things are opening up and a real new normal, is that some of those habits of, oh, we'll just move it all around very quickly, we'll just get to the kind of quickest answer, are potentially maintaining into this period. And we're now working really hard with our clients to go, okay, there's a huge opportunity here post pandemic. We need to relook at what the inputs are, what our expectations are, what that brief looks like, and stress test that brief. So I think, yeah, from what Kelly was saying, there's the brief itself, which is an important document, but it's the work that happens around that brief in terms of how the agency interrogates it, asks the question, challenges the brief, and also kind of hypothesizes. Sometimes you'll get a brief and you'll be like, is this the real brief, or is that actually kind of a question above this brief? And should we be answering the bigger question, and get really stuck into that before we get into this executional element? So that dialogue is vitally important, and creating space for that, because often when the brief is issued, the kind of clock is running down and there's a moment you need to hit, and there's a very kind of particular window. So we work a lot with our clients to kind of set up annual planning cycles that give us the space to ask those big questions, tackle those big problems, think, you know, ahead 3 years, and then get into the individual kind of transactional campaign briefs within that.
Okay, Caroline, what kind of advice would you give to a client on preparing a brief that you can work with?
So I think we've definitely seen more and briefs, or we call and briefs, which is where, you know, we want this and we want this and we want this and we want this, and we understand why that is, because let's face it, you know, clients have got less time, they've got to justify their spends, you know, they've got to get more out of really tight budgets, and so we just acknowledge that we all have to work with that. And so we have a conversation early on saying, look, we understand that the first version of the brief might be an and brief. We just need to build in more time so that we can work through that with you, so we can help to ask the right questions, so that we can prioritize and we can get to the right answers. And I think that that's something that's definitely being embraced, because sometimes nobody can see the wood for the trees, and it needs to be, going back to that word collaboration, it's got to be a collaborative effort to get to the right place. To Kat's point, sometimes you don't have enough time, and therefore you have to be a little bit more regimental in really pushing for a tight brief. But usually clients can understand that they kind of need to go one way or the other. I do actually just want to reference one of the chapters in the book which really brought a smile to my face, which was the one about the client wanting to own Christmas. Which I thought was just, you know, such a brilliant little story. We've been there, and I think what's fascinating there is that, you know, agencies have probably kind of created the perception that clients giving them a brief saying we want to own Christmas is the sort of brief that really excites an agency. It sounds really big, it sounds really meaty, it sounds like we can really get stuck into that, and probably we haven't done a good enough job of telling them that it almost sometimes strikes fear into our heart, because it's like, well, how would you own Christmas, and you don't have enough budget to own Christmas, and everybody wants to own Christmas. What do we do with that? So I thought that was a particularly good chapter to lean into.
Paul, is there anything you'd suggest about how briefs are shaped, or, you know, advice for shaping a brief?
Well, I want to pick up on something that actually has been said as a sort of theme. You know, you get good briefs, and Kelly obviously spends a lot of time with her experience producing good briefs, and you're encouraging your clients to spend good briefs, Kat and Caroline, and avoiding the and. What I would say is there are huge numbers of clients out there who are not very good at producing briefs. And each brief is chewed over, there's a fight, the work often gets used as a way of sorting out the brief. You know, there's enormous tension because there's less time, and the time pressure is building up and up and up. And actually my invitation to agencies is to kind of get above that and look at the skill level of the clients. What do we normally get from this client? And alongside the notion that Kat says about looking at the longer term of what are the requirements and shaping the timescale, is actually what do we need to do to get them to a level when they can give us a good brief, whether that's training them or motivating them to change. And I think one of the things for agencies is learning how to motivate clients to change. They're not going to change just by saying the brief isn't very good, or we're having difficulty with this, we're always running on the same problem, but actually getting to a higher level of motivation. You know, you want the best return for your investment. And generally clients are going to say yes. Well, then, okay, so, you know, inviting them, well, would you like to know a bit more about how you can get the very best from us? Well, most clients are going to say yes. Okay, so now we've got the opportunity to go and teach them something and give them regular feedback. Opening a different level of dialogue, I think, is a real opportunity to deal with the less professional clients, or the more problematic ones, or the ones that perhaps be a little less passionate about producing great work.
Well, you've mentioned feedback there, Paul, which is a nice segue to the next point I wanted to discuss, because you can have feedback on a particular brief, or you can have general feedback when projects are finished, feedback on individuals. So honest and open feedback is essential, but how do you get there? How do agencies and clients structure themselves to deliver feedback and train each other to listen and absorb feedback? I mean, how's feedback done, for instance, Caroline, within your agency with clients? Have you got a process? How do you approach it?
Actually, feedback is an area where we do run quite client-specific training, because kind of to Paul's point, we've noticed it's the area that clients can very quickly run out of budget or not have made enough allowance for the number of rounds of amends that they seemingly sometimes want to make. So actually, if you can make sure that feedback is better feedback first time, then you know that helps it helps the relationship, it helps budget, it helps timing. So we do this exercise and we run it with clients, but we also do it with internal teams, and it's around how to give good creative feedback. And you kind of start by going through different caricatures of bad creative critics. So that's things like perhaps a client that could be a blender who always likes to take little bits from different ideas and try and you know, make them work together. Or it could be something like the client who wants to be a creative, and so will just give you what they think it should look like and not really tell you what the problem is that they need you to solve, or the actual real piece of feedback. And then we get clients to self-identify with which of these kind of types they perhaps are closest to. They don't have to share that with us, but I think it's a really useful way to get them into the right mindset of the next stage of the conversation, which is, okay, well then let's flip all of those caricatures into what a good creative critic is, and suddenly the feedback in each case is the same, but there's a good way of feeding back and a bad way of feeding back. And that then helps us to get to the idea of kind of feeding forward, which I know is mentioned in the book, around how do you give a piece of feedback in a way that it helps the work to progress, that it helps you to work out, you know, what needs to happen next. And again, because you've taken everybody on that journey, and you know, it's an hour and a half session, but you more than reclaim that time, you know, over a single campaign, really. So exercises like that, I think everybody gets a huge amount out of, even if you've been appraising creative work and creative concepts for years. It's always good to stop and take a step back and realize, you know, perhaps where you can improve the way that you're feeding back to agencies.
Kat, what about your feedback processes?
Yeah,
how do they work?
We've got a very kind of strong culture of feedback at OMD, and we try and make sure it's a culture that we obviously share with our clients, but also have internally. I think it's really easy to kind of focus on the kind of task at hand and think, okay, I just need to get through and get things completed, rather than taking that time and step back to think what could make this better. I hadn't actually come across the feed forward approach that Paul illustrates in his book until I read the book, and that for me answered a lot of the problems that you sometimes get to with feedback, that it's not specific or directional enough. It might land on a problem but not give you the solution or how that kind of could build. Because a lot of the time when we've been exploring feedback, it's like, well, this meeting is too long, and that's like, okay, what do I do with that? That's not particularly useful or illustrative feedback. But feed forward, about, I think particularly with the feed forward, the thing I really liked with it is has inspired me about this? What little thing, what little nugget am I taking out that I really want to elevate? And I think that's a really interesting way of opening and framing that conversation, because that can lead you into some really interesting territories, while also then getting to a point of what's okay, what's working, and then what could be improved. So that's definitely something, we invite a lot of feedback. We have a lot of kind of mechanisms for feedback within the agency, but that's something that I'll be taking back with me from the book, and exploring how we can kind of use that framework more to get to quicker positive outcomes in terms of how we address feedback and actually utilize it.
So I want to
Kelly, have you got any?
Yeah, I want to build on that. As clients, we're always providing feedback, and in a way we dread it because it always seems to be negative, but we have to recognize that feedback is a gift. And I'll acknowledge I'm not great at giving feedback. And it wasn't until I started embracing this feed forward concept that Paul talks about in his book. By the way, I would recommend, if you're going to read any chapter, read that one. It's quick, but it is so impactful in that it gives you tools for how to serve up the good with the bad. And what I mean by that is, because feedback is often negative, we tend to put our guard up, we don't hear, we don't take it in. But if you can serve up feedback, both by starting with the positive, what did I like? How do I build on that? What's good? What's exciting me? As well as what concerns I have and where we could maybe shore up an issue. I think the feedback will be better interpreted and taken. So I really would encourage everyone to try that concept, put it to use. It's so simple, but you'll be surprised once you start doing it, how people respond to your feedback in a much different way. And as the person giving feedback, it's so much easier.
Just one thing that struck me as you were talking, I think that there is a move towards clients often asking the most junior members of their team to feedback first, and it's a way of empowering them, making sure that they've got a voice in the room, which is really important. But often they don't know how to give that feedback, and if they're the ones that are opening it first, they're really worried of saying they really like the idea, because actually they don't know what anybody else is thinking. And so feed forward is a great model, because it allows them to say what they like, but then also allow them to express where they think the idea needs to go, what the builds are. And because we're seeing that pattern repeat in many kind of different client meetings, there's sort of like an added value to those sorts of conversations now.
Agree.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Paul, anything to layer on feedback that we haven't raised already?
Well, you touched on it. I think, Kelly's right. There is an anxiety as a client, and it doesn't matter whether they're a junior client or a senior client, you're suddenly on the spot, right? And so the anxiety comes up, and inevitably, then the slightly critical voice cuts in, because it's way easier when you're on the spot to be critical about something. Anybody can be critical of something. And that then triggers off a negative reaction in the agency team of, oh my God, there goes the client again, being all negative. And yet this structure allows both the agency to have a direction forward and the client to make that really clear in a very palatable way. So it de-stresses, I think, everybody. So it's great to hear you guys are using it. I think that's fantastic.
Okay,
yeah, job
that's
done.
good.
That's great. I feel very
not over
happy
till it's
about
over. We're coming to the last of our questions, by the way. So we'd love to see some questions coming from the audience or some observations in chat. Please put questions in the Q&A or observations in the chat box, and we'll pick them up and kick them around. Staying with the feedback point, there's an elephant in the room we haven't discussed yet. It might be a while before we get face-to-face meetings or pitches, certainly in the UK. Anyway, I'm curious to know what advice the panel might have for keeping relationships alive, keeping them moving, when at the moment we're just communicating through screens, and as is pointed out in the book, 55% of overall communication is through physical body language. So has anyone got any advice or pointers of how they're managing to keep things moving and keep that engagement going with their partner, client, or agency in this particular period?
One thing
go on, Kelly.
One thing I've noticed in all of my Zoom calls with agencies is there's this behavior of silence. So the agency will pitch something, and for some reason, we're all just silent. And and then everyone hangs up the phone and the agency doesn't know how they did, and the client doesn't know kind of what the expectations are. So a technique I have started to try, or I've watched our agencies try with us, is establishing expectations at the beginning. Say at the very beginning, I'm going to reserve 10 minutes at the end of this call. And I'm going to ask you, what did you like about this campaign? What are your ideas in terms of how to build on it? And are there any concerns or issues? Because that then allows, it starts, you're able to tease out some of or get in better communication, and people end the call with a clear understanding of where they stand and what they need to do next. So that's just my little random technique that seems to be working.
What have you learned, Kat, or what are you putting into practice to try and keep things moving?
It's interesting that Kelly raised that as a kind of, you almost need to set new expectations for virtual meetings and kind of be really clear about those up front. The one thing I've learned personally throughout this whole kind of process and having to do Zoom and Teams and all of the rest of them is, you were told for years, body language is really important. That is like, a big part of how we communicate. And you kind of hear that and be like, yeah, okay, body language is important. But really it's what people say, and that's what I'm listening to. And then suddenly you get into these virtual setups, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, body language is incredibly important, and divorced of it, and eye contact as well, divorced of these things that we have built, our whole lives upon in terms of our most, important and intimate relationships through to kind of business relationships, it becomes very difficult. And, kind of Kelly talked about the silence at the end of the call, and for when you're kind of presenting to clients, where you would get energy from the room and people would respond to you, and you'd see, you don't have to say anything, but you'd see the physical that this is a good idea, and it's a good idea. That's why you're kind of bringing it to them. That's why you're suggesting it. But to see that palpable kind of energy sort of come in, and you can riff off that, and you cannot riff off that in a virtual call. You just don't get it in the same way. So I'm really excited about being able to come back to face-to-face meetings, because I think they are incredibly important, because that's where you'll be able to kind of read the room, stop the meeting, ask the question, get the build, that more organic kind of craft can come. Things are as they are, and we have to kind of work the way we have, and there's lots of benefits in a way to virtual working, in terms of, particularly from a global client perspective, having people in lots of different parts of the world able to connect face to face is great, and I think we will continue to use those. But knowing now when it's absolutely imperative that it's a face-to-face physical meeting to really get the most out of it, and taking the time and space to kind of craft that rather than it's easier and quicker to do virtual, I think will be a kind of key concern of everyone kind of going forward. And I'm just looking forward to more face-to-face meetings, because that's where the magic is. That's where the real excitement and passion comes. And this is brilliant technology. And, I wouldn't have thought it was possible kind of 10 years ago that we could so seamlessly transition, but that human interaction just can't be replicated.
Yeah, we all definitely miss it. Caroline, how have you encouraged your teams and kept them moving in their relationships, and what advice have you given them to make sure that they should remain strong?
It's interesting listening to Kelly talk about silence, because I think you can actually use silence in a very positive way at the start of the meeting. So one of the things that I've really struggled with over the last year is that we're constantly online, we constantly go into these meetings, and you have to switch your brain so quickly from one meeting to the next, and it's really tough. I mean, on some days it's particularly tough, and actually taking a few minutes at the start of the meeting just to make sure that, okay, everybody's taken a breath, everybody's in the right headspace to start, has actually had time to see what the meeting is and what it's about, and to find the reference notes is so important. Otherwise you're already starting the meeting at a pace and you just can't catch up. So I think thinking about how you can use silence or a pause at the start of the meeting to make sure that you do get the most out of the duration of that is absolutely worth the meeting itself being slightly shorter.
Okay, no, that totally makes sense. And Paul, we've lived through these past 12 months. Is there anything we can take from what we've learned that we can take forward with us?
I think from my point of view, just the reminder that we're human beings, and human beings really do need close proximal relationships to communicate effectively. These relationships are science fiction of 10, 20 years ago. I think they're fantastic. But I think, as Kat said recently, you know, clients or prospects buy people. They don't buy little mugshots on a screen. And it's very, very difficult for us all. I think so, you know, the sooner that we can be closer together, the sooner we can establish more effective, deeper, more meaningful communication, I think would be fantastic. And in the meantime, being forgiving ourselves and giving ourselves the opportunity either for silence at the beginning or for 10-minute breaks between sessions. I didn't go to a meeting yesterday. I bunked out because I thought, I am back to back. Somebody has put a meeting in with no pauses. I can't do that. And, you know, just being forgiving of ourselves. It's also, you know, just recognizing, you know, on average, we'll speak 15% louder on these calls than we would do face-to-face. It's unconscious. It's almost like we're trying to project more meaning because we can't see the micro expressions on each other's faces, which we normally pick up unconsciously. So at the end of the day, we're actually talking more loudly, we're using more energy, and we're really stressing ourselves to kind of decode what's going on, you know, and you know, see, you know, I'm looking closer to see if I can really see your expressions. I can't. And so I don't know really how you're reacting in a more detailed sense that will give me feedback then to moderate how I continue to talk. So it's a really challenging time. So being forgiving and giving yourselves support and adequate breaks, I think is really important.
No, I love that. I love the concept of forgiveness. And please tell me if I'm shouting and forgive me. We are getting some questions coming in from the audience, which is great. So I've got one from Kate Murtaugh here, who says, when relationships break down between a client and agency team or between specific members, has the panel got any tips or pointers on how you support rebuilding that relationship or motivate your agency team member to stick with it? What would you do in that situation, Caroline?
I think that, I mean, you know, I've been in that situation with members of my team, clients in the past, previous agencies, and I think it's about sitting down and looking at, you know, the cues and the conversations that have led up to that point, and then having a conversation with the client to find out how they're feeling, because it's very seldom kind of one-sided, and you always want to find both sides want to resolve it. It's just having that first conversation that's quite difficult. So, you know, gather the information in the first instance, and then, you know, have a quiet conversation with a client, because ultimately everybody wants their team to be happy. The client wants their team to be happy. You want your team to be happy. So having an informal conversation, off the record conversation to start with goes a long way.
Definitely, I'd agree. And I think there's also a role in those kind of breakdowns to, you know, thinking about the kind of analogy of like relationship counselling and couples counselling, and when things obviously go particularly difficult in that scenario, mediation is something that happens. You introduce a third party who can effectively give an independent view on how things are progressing, and also hear from both sides. And I think sometimes, depending on where the relationship is, and it might just be someone from, you know, another client team within the agency, not particularly close to that particular client relationship, can just offer that distance and that reset and that ability for both sides to air the problems and get them out, because that's important, because there's a lot of things that never get spoken about that can build up in terms of resentment. Get all of that out and then get to a place where that's been shared and we can kind of move forward, and sometimes just kind of another person in the mix just for that purpose, and then who kind of comes away again can really help to kind of reset and reframe a relationship for the better. But there needs to be almost that moment of acceptance, sharing of everything, not just the kind of matter at hand, but all of the kind of subtext and everything, and then bringing back together to kind of reset and re-engage that relationship.
And I completely agree with both Kat and Caroline. And just to quickly build, oftentimes when there's a breakdown between agency and client, they try to rebuild it at the top, so it becomes a top-to-top issue. And I would encourage everyone at every level to come together to do exactly what Caroline and Kat said, to meet with your counterpart, to discuss what's working and what isn't. And again, rebuild it at every level. Don't just sit back and say, well, that's a top to top issue. I think you'll get a lot out of that.
Paul, any contribution to the approach for rebuilding a faltering relationship?
Well, having picked up the pieces, or rather helped clients and agencies pick up the pieces, which is what I did for a great number of years, what I would say is the presenting issue, the complaint, is generally not the causal issue. So firstly, a really clear piece of diagnosis is required. That is definitely somebody that is not involved directly in the relationship, whether it's an external person like me or somebody else that's in the organization but elsewhere and doesn't have an axe to grind, ideally. So getting some clear diagnosis. The other thing is a bit like couples. You know, if you're in a couple relationship and things start to go wrong, it's really difficult to know how to claw your way out of the mire. It's very, very difficult because of all the complaints and the emotional energy. And just as, you know, a particular account director or whoever it is in an agency might have a lot of emotional energy about what's going on, it can be really difficult to decode when you're doing the diagnosis. And from this external perspective, you know, it is clear that a structure is needed. And in the book, I've put forward an algorithm, a model of client agency relationships, a holistic and dynamic model. It's the first one that's been produced, and we've researched it within the client relationship consultancy, and we use it now as a very firm model. It's called the Sound Relationship House, and it delineates the different component parts because it's a very complex thing. You've got the fit between the client and the agency, you've got a team and the resource involved in the team. There are commitments and deliverables, you know, and there's personal connection, and then there's narrative, and there are a number of aspects. And all of these are standing on, you know, the contractual foundations. And then above that, you've got a kind of tank of goodwill, which is the reserve that couples have as well. And so if you change one of those, and it could be any one of those, everything else is going to change too. So having a diagnostic framework is really, really important.
No, that's yeah, it's so important. So thanks for mentioning that, Paul. Here's an interesting one, which I'm going to throw to Paul first, actually. It's from Chantel Thompson. Paul, is there a risk or downside to becoming too close to a client?
I don't know what the definition of too close is, but so that's an interesting one. I think that what I would say is the kind of, if you can have an inner observer in your mind, or maybe there's somebody kind of looking above you, you can kind of separate yourself from the relationship and watch what's going on in this position and have that relationship, and also be stepping back to observe that relationship in some way, then I think that's probably okay. But I just don't know what that kind of proximal relationship would look like. What I do know is, though, that, you know, having had in the past myself some very close client relationships as well as some very acrimonious ones, the closer ones were by and large very, very productive. But the one thing I was always clear about was standing outside from an agency perspective, so I didn't get the boundaries blurred. I think sometimes agency folk, in the desire to please, can lose that boundary, and that has to be there because agencies are there to give their clients very good advice.
Perfect. Anyone else want to add at all about that risk or downside of coming too close to a client? Or can you never be too close to a client?
Well, I think there are, bounds are proprietary, but I think, I would, if you are, have a strong, really strong, close working relationship with a client, that is most often always a positive thing. Regular dialogue, and I think we'll have all experienced it where you meet someone through work who was your client, and 10, 15 years later they're still your friend. You aren't working with them anymore, but you've got that strong kind of relationship, and everyone experiences that, and that's positive. Because again, one of the benefits of the industry is you work with brilliant people, like-minded people who want to do great work, and when you kind of come together with shared values, and that becomes a close working relationship, that can be really positive, but it can also have kind of positive benefits for you long term as well. So I don't think beyond anything, how close is taken, I think close relationships are good.
Okay. We are beginning to run towards the end of our hour. I'm just going to ask one more question. I've prepped myself. We all know relationships can get old and stale, and certainly agencies need to have antennae and be on the alert for when there might be a potential breaking point. So I'd like to know, what are the warning signs a client may be looking to call or review? Caroline, if you know, what advice have you got that there may be an imminent problem on the horizon?
I think one of the warning signs is when a client that perhaps has usually been very communicative have come back to you regularly and quickly whenever you've contacted them in the past, suddenly doesn't do so anymore. And sometimes that can be a sign that some conversation is happening in the background, and because they don't know the outcome of that conversation, they don't know what to say to you, and you've built such a close relationship, you know, that they don't want to tell you anything but the truth. So I think, you know, checking in with clients regularly and spotting any changes in that behavior is a good first warning sign.
Kat, have you got any advice about looking out for storms ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think Caroline's hit the nail on the head that silence is deadly. When, you know, if you're kind of reviewing your week and you're thinking, oh, I haven't heard from that person, and there's a bit of human nature in, oh, I'm sure, you know, optimism, it's fine, it's absolutely fine, but that is the kind of little warning sign. There should be a tug in the pit of your stomach to be like, I'll just give them a call. And then you know, things are troubling when you've called them and someone who would always pick up to you is kind of, you know, replying on email going, oh, I'll give you a call, I'm really busy. That's like, and that's as Caroline said, probably to do with the fact that there's something else going on, and they don't want to bring that into that conversation with you. They respect you, they want to have an authentic, trusted relationship, so they're kind of dodging having what could be an awkward conversation. So in that, you have to kind of fight your kind of urge to be like, oh, I'm sure everything's fine, they're just busy, and find a way to kind of create that connection and unearth what's going on. Because if it is something that's problematic, the sooner it's surfaced, the easier it is to kind of fix and address.
I think Kat said it so well, silence is deadly. And the only thing I would add is a solution, and that is go see them. Avoid the phone, avoid email, you know, as Paul encourages everyone in the book, get on the plane, jump in the Uber, like go see them, go sit in front of your client and find out what is going on, because lack of communication is not good.
No, definitely not. Paul, anything on warning signs and reading the runes about things going awry?
I think the biggest challenge for agencies is, by and large, the people that work in agencies have a very high level of optimism bias and pain avoidance. And the same is true of marketeers. Marketeers often don't want to tell the whole and honest truth, and agencies really don't like hearing the truth and want to avoid it, by and large. A lot more than the general population. We don't have time to go into why that particular group of people, those group of people are in agencies and clients, but that is generally true. So just be warned.
Wow. Okay, stern warning there. We are coming to the end of the session. Any final pieces of advice you give for the future and making sure relationships are strong and can be maintained? You know, your last takeaway you'd like to give to the audience looking ahead for the future. Kelly, last bit of advice.
Oh gosh, I think it would just be to reiterate so much of what we just talked about in terms of, you know, clear, concise communication, collaboration, and helping to build that trust, right? You know, trust is earned. And so, you know, I think those three things are probably critical to that strong and lasting relationship.
Caroline, and anything you'd add, and anything you might be going to do differently when normality, as we call it, returns as well?
I would say straight after this session, write down the name of 3 clients that you haven't spoken to recently, pick up the phone, call them.
Brilliant. Kat, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I'd agree completely with Caroline. Yeah, it's always good to use these kind of sessions to make you think, oh, that niggling little thing that I was slightly avoiding. Now is a good time to kind of face into that and, you know, make your to-do list and be like, I will invest in that. And I think as Paul said at the top, you know, making sure that you're taking time and space within your day to work on the relationships and keep checking in on those, I think is really sage advice, and not, you know, to build the time, block the time to do that, as well as all of the many things that we all have to kind of produce and do. So I think that, yeah, really, really good advice.
And final word to Paul. What's the final nugget of wisdom you'd leave us with?
I think the the panel here have done a very good job. I don't want to say anything more. I think they've encapsulated it really well.
Marvellous. Well, I mean, the hour has flown by, and I hope the audience has got a lot of insights they can work with and can take away. The book, Connecting with Clients, very small investment, might be great ROI if it just saves one valuable relationship. So I do advise people to pick it up and take a look at it. Big virtual round of applause for the panel, Kat, Caroline and Kelly. And thanks so much, Paul, for bringing your wisdom to this session.
And one thing I would say is, if anybody wants to communicate with me, ask me questions, my email will come up. By all means, join the conversation and contribute what you want and ask, and I'll always feedback and communicate with you.
Marvellous. Expect the floodgates to open. All right, then. Thank you very much for a marvellous session. Thank you, audience, for your attention.